This is a presentation on how to fall in love with accessibility by Kate Kalcevich, Digital Accessibility Manager at Canada Post, Certified Web Accessibility Specialist and Champion of Accessibility since 2001. In the last decade, she has redesigned Ontario.ca, developed the Inclusive Design Toolkit, created Ontario's Design Guide, and taught role-based digital accessibility, and currently she is leading Canada Post in making their websites and applications accessible. Okay, Kate, is there anything that you need from in terms of screen sharing or anything else?
No, I think if you're ready for me, I can start sharing my screen.
Okay, I think I'm ready. Just a minute here. Let me make sure that you are allowed to share the screen. Okay, I am making you a co-host. So
okay.
you should have the ability to share. That's it.
Yeah, got it going. All right, let me flip this into presenter mode. All right. And what happens when I go into presenter mode is I lose the chat window. So I think because my talk is fairly short, maybe we should hold the questions to the end. So if people are typing things into chat, I'll have a look at that as soon as I stop screen sharing. So just be patient. If I don't get to your question right away, my talk is really not super long. We've got lots of room for questions at the end. I normally like to take questions throughout, but just because the chat's not visible, I'm doing my screen share, and I do better with questions through chat. I can take voice questions, but I'll get into that in just a second. So first off, the topic, how to fall in love with accessibility. I've been a longtime advocate for accessibility, as you heard, and I think a lot of people don't really enjoy it as much as they should because of the way they're introduced to it. So I'd like to talk about taking a different perspective about accessibility and how you can get to doing it in a way that's more enjoyable. So I've been a long-time public servant. I worked for the Ontario government for 18 years. I'm currently with Canada Post. I've worked as a designer and a developer and a manager, so quite broad experience there. I've been self-employed in the past as well. In government, I spent my most time with the Ontario Digital Service, so hi to everyone from ODS that's here. I also worked a bit in accessibility policy, and I'm currently with Canada Post. And also in that text, it says PWD, which is short for a person with disability. That's me. I have hearing loss in both of my ears. I wear hearing aids. I read lips. I sometimes have trouble understanding, when people are talking. I don't always hear well, especially if your voice isn't very, very clear or very, very loud. So be patient with me if I ask you to repeat your question or put your question in the chat, because I read really well. So quick definition, this is my definition of accessibility that I like to use. I like to talk about it as usability for people with disabilities, which is not the common definition that you'll hear, but you'll understand why as I go through my presentation, why that's such an important focus for me. 1 in 4 Ontarians has a disability. It's 1 in 5 if you count all Canadians. And of that 1 in 4 with a disability, about 50% of those have what we call an invisible disability. So like mine, you can't see my hearing aids, they're super tiny. Lots of people have pain and mobility issues that aren't very obvious. And a lot of people have mental health issues, among others. So roughly about 60% of people with disabilities can benefit from some kind of web accessibility. They would have trouble using a website or an application if it wasn't made accessible. So that's why it's so important. It's a huge number. What we really need is lots of people who know a little bit about accessibility and a few people who know a lot. This is just my opinion and my perspective, having worked in the field for next year is going to be my 20-year anniversary doing accessibility. We need a couple of people like myself who have a really deep knowledge of accessibility to guide everyone else. But what we really need is every designer, every developer, every content writer to know a little bit about how to work accessibility into their job. And for this particular talk, I'm going to be targeting developers and going to give you that little bit of knowledge to help you do a little bit more when it comes to accessibility. So I'm just going to touch very briefly. I can't talk about accessibility without mentioning the standards. So we call the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the WCAG. That's the acronym WCAG. Some people call it WCAG or whatever. I call it WCAG. And that is an international standard for web accessibility. And it has a total of 78 success criteria. So those are criteria that you have to meet to be considered accessible. And there's 3 different levels of accessibility. There's very basic, bare minimum, level A. There's AA, which is in between, which most people aim. And I've got a typo there. I'm missing my AAA. I've got A, AA, and AA again. It's supposed to be AAA at the end. AAA is the highest level of accessibility. And we have a new version of the guidelines coming soon this year with 9 more criteria. The point I really want to drill home here is there's 78 things to think about when it comes to accessibility, and there are going to be 9 more. It's not really an easy introduction to accessibility. So I wouldn't recommend people start with the guidelines, even though I'm mentioning them, because so much of the training and so much of the conversation around accessibility is around these guidelines, and you're going to run into them if you want to learn more about it. And it's certainly something you can look into once you are familiar with the basics of accessibility, but I don't recommend it as a starting point. It tends to be overwhelming for people, and it's complicated. And we also have a 3rd version coming along. So there's version 1, various versions of 2, 2.0, 2.1, 2.2. There's 3.0. There's just a lot to learn. And this is just an excerpt directly from the guidelines. It's not written in plain language. It's hard to parse. And in fact, what it says is you can't just read the guidelines themselves, but you actually have to read 2 separate documents. So you have guidance about how to understand the guidelines and how to meet the criteria in the guidelines. So if you think about somebody who's new to accessibility, if you were to start with these guidelines and then the 2 supporting documents as well, and going through, you know, all those nearly 80 guidelines and trying to remember and understand all of them with all these supporting documents, it's just overwhelming. And I've heard this feedback from people who want to get into accessibility over the years that, you know, they start trying to learn the guidelines and it just stops them in their tracks. So I'm going to talk about what you can do instead. And in fact, trying to learn accessibility by reading the guidelines, I would use the metaphor that, or the analogy that it's similar to trying to ride a bike, trying to learn how to do that. So I got a picture of a kid learning to ride a bike. He's actually on the bike with his dad, or you have your Cycling for Dummies handbook. It's not really how you would learn to ride a bike. You wouldn't just get a book from the library and read about riding a bike. You would get on a bike and you would start riding it. So same applies for accessibility. In my opinion, you need to just get out there and start doing it, and that's the best way to learn it. And so I've got 3 tips on how you can go about doing that. For developers specifically. So number 1 is use your keyboard. A lot of the developers I know, they live in the keyboard, they live in the command line, they're very comfortable with that. And in fact, that's one of the best ways to test for accessibility. And I'll talk about how to do that in a second. The second is to use something called the screen reader. So what a screen reader is it's software that reads aloud a website. We commonly think of screen readers being used by people who are blind because they can't see, they listen to a website instead. But it's also used by people with other types of disabilities who can see. For instance, somebody with dyslexia, they might not be a really fast reader, so they prefer to hear the website instead. And the third thing is to get comfortable with your built-in computer magnifier. There are a lot of people with low vision who use a magnifier to zoom in and make everything look larger. And if you can use these 3 technologies, which are free and easy to use, and start testing the things that you build, you can start seeing where the barriers are for people with disabilities. And then you can start digging into, well, how do I actually fix those? But the first place to start is understanding the technology that people with disabilities are using. And there are more than these. I suggest these 3 because they are very common and they're an easy starting point. You can get all of them for free. And then as you go deeper into an accessibility journey, you can start learning about other types of technology. So the thing I suggest all developers start with is just keyboard testing. What you want to do is just do away with your mouse and your trackpad and use your tab key and tap through everything, and everything that's interactive, that's links, buttons, form fields, you should be able to access those with the tab key. And while you're doing that, you should be able to see the focus at all times. So the focus is that blue ring that shows up if you start tabbing through a website. And it could be different. It might not be blue. For instance, I have my settings on my computer to make my focus pink. But general default out of the box for most computers, you have a blue focus ring. And then you want to make sure that that tab order makes sense. So you might have like a left column on the page where you have an order form, and maybe on the right-hand side, you have a summary of the order. And you want to make sure, you know, you've thought about that tab order for somebody who's using a keyboard. Where are they going and where are they going next? And you want to check that you're not getting stuck anywhere. So you want to just tab through the entire thing and make sure you don't get trapped. Now that's super easy. That takes like less than 5 minutes. There's no technology to set up or install. And right off the bat, you're going to find problems, some of the problems that you might have with accessibility. People who use the keyboard tend to be people who have mobility or pain issues. They might not have the dexterity to use a mouse to hold it still enough. They might, you know, have a nervous condition where their hands are shaking. They might have arthritis. So it's a fairly common thing for people to not have that like ability to use a mouse. Now the second thing, and I do have links throughout this presentation, but I'm going to have the URL spelled out at the end. So everything that I link to in here is going to be on my last slide, accessible through a URL. I have a GitHub repository that I'm linking to here, and I'm going to just have the address of my repo at the end. So, and in that repo, I have instructions on how to use a screen reader, where to find one, how to install it, all of that. There's videos, there's shortcut keys, everything. So it's your second step if you're starting to dig into accessibility. So opening up the screen reader and just listening to your site. And you can use the screen reader on a phone as well, on a smartphone or on a desktop or on a laptop. So you just want to listen to your entire page and make sure that what you hear matches what you see. You want to check that all the images and icons you have on the page are described accurately, that you can understand what they are by listening to the description, and that of course you even have a description for your images and icons. And you'll notice that right away. If you don't have one and you're testing with the screen reader, you're going to hear the file name and it's not going to sound pretty. And when you interact with anything that's interactive, you want to think about, would you understand what's happening if you couldn't see? So things like links, is it clear that this is a link? The screen reader should read link if you've used the appropriate code. Form fields should be read as edit fields, and buttons should be read as buttons. And then there's things that are more complicated, like accordions and tabs, and there should be cues to the interactions. And if you're not hearing anything that says this is an accordion, if I click it, it's going to open something, then that can be confusing for somebody who can't see. And then the last type of testing is with the magnifier. So when you're interacting again with those interactive elements, can you see the changes that happen on the page? So an example of this is you click a button and a modal opens. Do you actually see that modal when you're magnified? And I suggest that people do magnification at about 400% at least replicate what somebody, with low vision would be using. Because it's very common that, you might add something to a shopping cart and you'll have a modal pop up and say, successfully added to a cart, or there will be some kind of notification off to the side. But guess what? If you're zoomed in 400% off to the side, could be completely off screen. So that's a good thing to check for. And then the second thing is, if you deliberately cause an error on a form, do you see the error notification? So that's another common issue, that you're at the bottom of a form field, you hit submit, and your error messages are way up on the page. And if you're zoomed in, you have no idea that anything on the page changed. So I want to touch very briefly on something called ARIA, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It is code that developers can add to their site to explain interactions. So when I talked about opening a modal, there's code, ARIA code, that you can add to that modal to tell a screen reader user that it is a modal and that it opened. There's code that you can add to button to say this is an accordion and it's open or it's closed, or these are tabs and they're open or closed. So there's a lot to learn when it comes to ARIA, and almost everyone gets it wrong at first. I've worked with so many developers who are very well-intentioned and they want to use ARIA, and it's just difficult to understand. So what I suggest is don't try to write your own ARIA ever. Not until you're really comfortable with accessibility, maybe a couple years in. I got it wrong, everyone gets it wrong. Instead, what you should do is try to find an accessible component library and use that. So if you need a drop-down, pull one from Angular Material Library, or the Reach UI for React, or Viewify for Vue. Or I've got a plain HTML and JavaScript component library in my GitHub repo, so you can pull anything you need from there. So don't try to write it yourself. There's no guarantee that somebody else who made the library got it right. I have checked the Angular Material Library, and that one's quite good. I haven't checked the Reach and the Viewify ones. I just looked at their site and I looked at their statements of accessibility, and I looked at some of the instructions they gave, and they seem pretty good. They seem to know what they're doing. I haven't checked their code in detail, but I think it's a better starting point, and especially if these things are publicly available, it's likely that other accessibility advocates have seen them and are commenting on them or interacting with them and giving feedback on them. So it's better than you trying to do it on your own. So this slide is common question that I get with developers. They sometimes run into something difficult, and there's that WTF moment where they don't know what to do. For instance, they're opening a modal and they don't know, where do I put the focus? Do I put it on the whole thing? Do I put it on the first element? If I'm making tabs and I'm making them operable by arrow keys like you're supposed to, according to ARIA specifications, are people going to be confused because they expect to tab through the tabs instead of use the arrow key, right? So there are all kinds of confusing things that it's tricky to figure out what to actually do in a specific scenario. And so I've got like a 4-step process of what you should do if you've got a difficult decision to make. Number one is do some user testing if you can, with people with disabilities. At Canada Post, we have a vendor called Fable Tech Lab, and they're a Toronto-based startup, and they provide accessibility testing services. So they hire people with disabilities, and I can just send them a link to a page, and they test this page, and they will tell me what problems they had using the page. And so I can hit 5 people with different types of disabilities using different technology in one quick, it takes like a day or 2 for me to get feedback that way. That might not be feasible for everyone. And so my next suggestion would be, if you can't test with real users with disabilities, is AT is short form for assistive technology. So that would be things like using the keyboard only, using a screen reader, or using a magnifier, or any of those other tools. So do some testing yourself and see how it sounds, see how it works. and try to figure out what makes sense. Work with your UX designer and say, okay, if this is my experience and this is the technology I'm using, what makes sense here? Third option would be do a pros and cons list. So if I put the focus here, what are the pros of that? What are the cons? If I put the focus here, you know, somewhere else, what would happen? You know, try to put yourself in that mindset and do a list, and then just make a choice. And then the fourth option, there is a Slack channel called the A11Y Slack. So A11Y is short for accessibility. There are 11 characters between the A and the Y. So we use the short form A11Y, or ALI, sometimes it's called. So there's a global accessibility Slack. And that's a really great place to ask these questions. And accessibility experts go there all the time. I go there when I have a difficult question. I'm like, I'm really not sure what to do here. There are no rules. There are no guidelines. I can't figure this out through testing. Somebody help me. But anyone's welcome to go there and ask their questions about accessibility. So that's a great resource because it kind of gets you access to like this global community of accessibility experts for free. So be respectful of their time and try to do your own research first. But if you can't come to a conclusion and you really need help, it's a great place to go. So I just wanted to start wrapping up with some common complaints about accessibility and why people don't enjoy it. You know, I hear that it's hard. So to that, I would say start with the easy stuff. Just simply start with keyboard support. That's super easy to do. People say it's boring, so use some of the fun technology. I think screen readers are really cool, and I'm going to give a quick demo of that. People say they don't know how to do whatever. Try the accessibility Slack. You can get the answers there. Compliance is impossible, so accessibility compliance is just too hard. I hear that all the time. So instead, let's stick with this concept of usability for people with disabilities. You know, if we can use something with technology that people with disabilities use and the people can use it, that's more important than compliance. People say they don't know ARIA, so I said earlier, use a component library, start there. People complain that there's too much to do and I can't do it all. So you don't have to do it all. You can do just your part. If you're a developer, just stick with making your code accessible or ask your team to help. You know, something is better than nothing. So, and that's not the message we often hear about accessibility. We often hear, if you don't do everything perfect and you don't do full accessibility and full compliance, you're a terrible person. And I don't believe that. I think if you're doing something and you're trying and you're starting and you're committed to making things better for people, that's good. That's a good start. Nobody starts off perfect. I know I didn't. And just a reminder, really, what the outcome is it's not to have compliance with the accessibility guidelines. The outcome is to make something that's usable for people with disabilities. And this is easy to forget because a lot of times if you're working in an organization, they're really worried about legal compliance above everything else. But the whole point of the laws that we have around accessibility is to make it easier for people with disabilities. So if we focus on that as our ultimate goal, that's the more important thing, because the second we start focusing on compliance with some set of guidelines, we're forgetting about the people. And that doesn't lead to the best outcomes for accessibility. You can have a fully compliant site that meets all the accessibility guidelines, and it's still hard to use. And at that point, you've just invested a lot of time and money, and you haven't achieved much. And I just wanted to wrap up with a short PSA, public service announcement. I've seen a lot of negativity around people not wearing masks on social media lately. And I know people are really afraid and there's a lot going on, but just a reminder that not everyone can wear a mask. And there actually is an exemption in the Toronto bylaw for wearing masks for people who can't. And it's not just for people who have breathing difficulties. So when I'm out and about with my husband, now that everyone's wearing a mask, I can't read anyone's lips. So I actually need him to be my interpreter. So I've gone from being a fully independent person to needing to bring somebody with me every time I go shopping. And he can't wear the mask, otherwise I can't read his lips. So you might look at him and think, you know, he's healthy, why isn't he wearing a mask? But there are things that you can't see and things that you don't know. And it's important to respect people's privacy. You know, people have various reasons why they can't wear a mask, and a lot of them are personal health reasons. So just a reminder to be kind and keep an open mind. And here's my contact information. I'm happy to take questions. I've got my email, webkate@live.ca. I'll take questions now as well. My GitHub repository is github.com/Kate Kalcevich. That's where I have resources on like how to use a screen reader, you know, where to get it. I have my component library with all the ARIA accessible components. I'm on LinkedIn and I'm on Twitter, and all of it under my full name, which I know is tough to spell. And John did such a great job. He actually pronounced it correctly, which very few people do. It's Kate Kalcevich. So I will minimize that. Keep it on screen long enough for people to have a look at that. And let me see if I can pull up the video again. Will I still keep that up there? Oh, it's in the chat. Perfect. I see it there. Okay, so I guess that means I can stop sharing so I can see people on video again. I got one question coming from Raphael. Is there an accessible data visualization community? There is a channel in the Slack for data visualizations in the Global Accessibility Slack. And there is a library, the name of which, D3 Visualization Library, which has accessibility built into it. Yeah. Any other questions? If anyone wants to write them in the chat, or and I'm happy to take opposing points of views too, if anyone have a bit of a debate. David says, dang, I was hoping it wasn't going to be D3. What we got? Tips for social media accessibility. Actually, I have a really good link. Maybe I should just pop that into the chat. I was just reading the government, the UK government just put out a guide to accessible social media campaigns. So I'm going to pop that in there. Some highlights from that. A lot of it comes around having alt text on your images and captions on your video. Those are kind of the main things. Not every platform allows you to put alt text, but there's usually other ways you can put a description of the images in your post. Another thing is to think about your hashtags. Camel casing your hashtags makes them a lot easier to parse, just from a reading perspective and also from a screen reader listening to them. And I can definitely share this presentation. I have a comment asking to share the presentation, so I can do that as well. Another question about the hashtag. So just, I'll give an example here. So this is typed in the chat. Oops, I actually misspelled my last one.
Super owl. Super
yeah,
owl.
it was supposed to be superb owl. So if you camel case it, each word where the first letter of each word is uppercase, the screen reader will do a better job of reading it. So if you did Super Bowl all lowercase versus Super Bowl uppercase S, uppercase B, it would read it right. It might try to pronounce it if you didn't do the camel case as superb owl.
Which may, of course, be what you intended.
Questions are moving fast and I can see them. So from Israel, do you include automatic validation with your dev team? How helpful is that? I definitely do. My favorite tool that I recommend for developers is Axe accessibility plugin, but there are lots of good ones out there. And I suggest, I started with using the assistive technology like the keyboard, the screen reader, magnifier, because I think that's a good place to start. To use an automated tool to test for accessibility, you need to understand a little bit more about the guidelines, because you're going to get a whole bunch of recommendations that might make no sense to you if you're not familiar with the guidelines. So it's definitely helpful, but it usually is more helpful if you have a good background in accessibility, or you have somebody on your team who can help explain some of the findings from the validator. Just going through, again, lots of comments, but okay, question from Sam. Have you ever had to make trade-offs or prioritize between competing accessibility requirements? Oh, definitely. And that's where testing with real users can help you to understand. One of the biggest challenges we have sometimes is you have a legacy, really old application, and the cost to try to build accessibility into that would be quite challenging. So that's where you've got the challenge with, you're not competing accessibility priorities, but actually just budget consideration. And that's where looking at what's really going to be a barrier for real people is more important. Certain things like the accessibility guidelines want you to have perfect code. And sometimes having imperfect code doesn't actually stop anyone from using your site. So it may not be the most important thing to refactor all of your code. I'm trying to think of what's a competing accessibility. Sometimes higher contrast is better for people with low vision, but higher contrast can be bad for people with ADHD or who are easily distracted by bold colors. So you try to generally pick something that works well for people with low vision, and then the assumption is that people who need different color combinations will hopefully use either Windows high contrast mode, or you can have a style picker where you switch between two different modes on your site. Although that's tricky because most people who are browsing the internet, they don't want to be picking distinct styles for every single website that they visit. You know, if you think of how many websites you visit in a day, do you really want to be adjusting the font size on every single site using a built-in tool? No. You know, people are busy. People with disabilities are busy too. Any other questions? Get them in the chat. Yeah, we got one more from Israel. Have you ever had to choose between be accessible versus be WCAG compliant in some projects? It does come up, and I think that's a tough one. Like, that's usually not a developer's decision to make. That's usually something that is set by the accessibility priorities of your organization and your leadership. You know, I find a lot of organizations are very compliance focused. I worked for the Ontario government for 20 years. You know, they have their own accessibility legislation. They're very compliance focused. And now at Canada Post, we're very user focused. So I think there's no easy answer to that. My preference is always, like when I spoke about the outcome is usability for people with disabilities. So my preference is always to put the people first over the guidelines and the legal stuff. And I think you can have conversations about legal risk, because what if you made a fully compliant site and somebody with a disability still couldn't use it? You could still get sued. Versus if you focus on the usability aspect, you're more likely to meet people's needs and not have a complaint. And if you do have a complaint, working with people to resolve the complaint is probably the best approach. A lot of companies get a complaint about accessibility, and we had this happen with Domino's Pizza, where they got an accessibility complaint and they just said, no, we're not going to fix our website. We're going to go to court. That was not the right answer. The right answer is to work with the person who made the complaint if you want to avoid legal risk. Anna, sorry, I'm trying to pronounce that. And then Okay, I'm just going to stop. I don't want to butcher your name. Anyway, the question was if you could post something about a global accessibility Slack. The tricky thing about the global accessibility Slack is I don't think the automated joining actually works. I think somebody needs to invite you. Sam has posted a link to it. If you can't get in, send me an email and I will invite you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Sabrina asked, are there any good articles or courses on web accessibility? I do have a whole bunch of them in my GitHub repo. So I've got a repo called Accessible Accessibility, and it's got a page with a list of all different trainings. And David says he's on the Slack as well. He can probably send invites. And yes, you don't have to be an admin to invite someone to the global Slack. You just need to be a member. I just want to check with our organizers. Do we need to stop questions at any point?
Never. I'm just kidding. No, defer to John. John, you're muted.
We do not, no.
I think that might be the last of it anyway. I don't see any more questions coming in. Well, thank you everyone for listening.
Well, on behalf of the rest of us, let me take the MC's privilege and say it was a wonderful presentation. I was very glad to hear it all. I think it was excellent, and yes, kudos and thank you, and yes, absolutely, great presentation. And I invite everybody to give a thumbs up and or a clap in the reactions at the bottom of your screen.
Thanks, everyone. And I can hang out for a little while if people want to just send me a question on the chat. I'll hang out till about 8:30, so I'll be here.
Okay, great. Okay, what we might end up doing is set up. We have breakout rooms available for people, so we'll just give you one and create one for you and anybody who wants to join the conversation. And on that note, thank you very much. And I'm just about to try and sieg into. Sorry, I will try to sieg into getting up our document, which is the Hacknight document. And okay. I'm sorry, this is going to take me another 2 seconds.